This is BBC News. I'm Vicky Young. The headlines at 4. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has said he would sanction operations in Syria only if they had the UN's approval. Voices from inside the devastation in Syria. The BBC hears from a mother and daughter who survived the suspected chemical attack in eastern Ghouta a week ago.
We went back down to the basement and saw how they were bringing the martyrs. Instead of breathing the air, we breathed the smell of blood.
Hundreds of Australian firefighters are tackling a large bushfire threatening homes in the suburbs of Sydney. The chief executive of the world's largest advertising agency, Martin Sorrell, is stepping down. Also coming up, jubilation at the Commonwealth Games. England beat Australia in the netball to secure the greatest result in their history and win their first Commonwealth gold medal. And at 4:30, Newsbeat speaks to people who lose their hair at a young age. Good afternoon and welcome to BBC News. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has said he would only consider involvement in Syria if it had the backing of the UN. It follows yesterday's missile strikes by the US, France and the UK on suspected chemical weapon sites. Meanwhile, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, said no further military action is planned, but that the government would study the options if Syria used chemical weapons again. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
British forces in action. 4 Tornado aircraft took part in bombing raids on chemical production and storage facilities in Syria yesterday. And today, the government was clear. This was about sending a signal that the use of chemical weapons, whether in Salisbury or in Syria, wouldn't be tolerated. It wasn't about changing the course of the conflict in the Middle East, though the Foreign Secretary didn't absolutely rule out further action.
There is no proposal on the table at the moment for further attacks because so far, thank heavens, the Assad regime has not been so foolish as to launch another chemical weapons attack. If we say that we are limiting our action to chemical weapons, our particular desire to reinforce that prohibition, which is what this is all about, then yes, of course it follows that the rest of the Syrian war must proceed as it will.
His justification for the action was in part that chemical weapons had been used here in Britain too, and he was dismissive of Russian suggestions that the UK could have been behind the Salisbury poisoning or had faked the Syrian attack.
It is plainly an utterly preposterous and deranged suggestion.
The Labour leader opposed the airstrikes and has called for renewed diplomacy to bring about a ceasefire.
I can only countenance involvement in Syria if there's a UN authority behind it.
The Russians vetoed UN resolutions on this 6 times now.
There
is no reason to think they'll all stop.
Both sides have either vetoed or threatened to veto. There obviously has not been agreement.
So what would he do if he had incontrovertible evidence that the Assad regime had used chemical weapons?
Confront Assad with that evidence, confront any other group that may be fingered because of that, maybe, I'm saying maybe, I don't know, and then say they must now come in and remove and destroy those weapons.
Political disagreements aren't limited to whether the Syrian airstrikes should have taken place. Even some MPs who backed the military action are deeply unhappy that it took place without a prior vote in Parliament. The Prime Minister will address MPs tomorrow, but there are now calls for the law to be changed so that any action in future would have to be approved not just by the Cabinet, but by Parliament. Labour wants a new War Powers Act to give MPs a say. More immediately, the SNP is calling for an emergency debate.
If there is to be any further change to the role of UK forces in Syria, any change to that or further change to that should be sanctioned by a parliamentary vote.
The Prime Minister will hope this action doesn't have to be repeated, but even some of her own MPs will want greater scrutiny of her decisions. Ian Watson, BBC News.
Well, a little earlier I spoke to our political correspondent Mark Lebel and asked him what the chances were of a parliamentary vote taking place.
There's a lot of opposition parties calling for a vote, the SNP in particular calling for an emergency debate which would force a vote. Now, it would be a protest vote, if you like, at the very least. It wouldn't bind the government, but it would expose divisions in several of the parties between some of the MPs and a leader. Now, one of those parties, Labour, has also calling for a vote. And they're particularly unhappy, Jeremy Corbyn is particularly unhappy about what he calls the dubious legal nature of the justification for these strikes that Theresa May launched in Western Syria, particularly by choosing humanitarian grounds. He says that's still a legally dubious area. He said that he'd only, as we heard there, countenance involvement in Syria if there is a UN authority behind it. But some Conservatives have come and said, well, Jeremy Corbyn knows full well that Russia would veto that, so they accuse him of ignoring what's going on the ground in Syria. As for the Lib Dems leader, Vince Cable, he seems less fussed about the legality. He wants more certainty about whether this was a one-off strike or whether it's part of a sustained campaign.
Now, Theresa May is coming to the Commons tomorrow to make a statement. I mean, she's likely to be on her feet for 2 or 3 hours taking questions from MPs. That clearly won't be enough for some. There is the issue here of who can make these very important decisions, and there will be some who say, well, it's quite right that the Prime Minister, the Cabinet, should have that flexibility, if you like, to be able to make these decisions.
That's right. There has been a convention, an unenforceable convention, if you like, that the Prime Minister would bring these decisions to Parliament. But in this case, she clearly hasn't done that. Labour want to stop that being the case. They want to introduce what's called a War Powers Act. According to the press release which dropped at midday today, they want to enshrine in law that the government must seek parliamentary approval before committing to planned military action. Now, calls for a War Powers Act have come before after interventions in Afghanistan, Libya, and also Iraq, for something stronger than this unenforceable convention. Now, tentative plans were dropped officially around 2 years ago to the day today by the then Defence Secretary Michael Fallon and then Prime Minister David Cameron. They said they didn't want to be artificially constrained in action to keep this country safe. But if this were to go ahead, the Shadow Foreign Secretary Emily Thornberry reassured the viewers of Peston on Sunday that if the Prime Minister got kidnapped or if the country was invaded, there wouldn't have to be a delay. You could just get on and respond. On a practical note, would we have been able to recall Parliament in this instance? Now, I spoke to one Labour and one Conservative MP this morning, both in support of the strikes, and they basically said no. Because of where everybody was spread around the globe, the MPs wouldn't have been able to get back in time to match French and American deadlines. So that would have left Britain looking isolated and weak. Boris Johnson told CNN today that the reason they didn't get parliamentary approval because they wanted to focus on the speed and efficiency of the operation. But Jeremy Corbyn is adamant that Theresa May should have recalled Parliament, and if not, then she should have held the vote before doing anything tomorrow when everybody returns. And he seems to think that that's the way that the public mood is going, and some of the early polling supports his view.
Mark Lebel there. Well, the Syrian government denies having used chemical weapons and has insisted it is not breaking any international laws which prohibit their use. So just what do they say the US, French and British missions targeted? Seth Doane from CBS News went to see one of the damaged sites in Damascus and sent this report.
One of the targets of those airstrikes was still smoldering late this afternoon. The U.S. military says the Barzeh complex in Damascus was a center for the research, development, production, and testing of chemical and biological weapons.
Your office was there?
Yes, where you see the smoke, this scientist, Syed, told us. He's been here for 38 years and said he cried when he saw this place today, his life's work destroyed.
Were chemical weapons being developed here?
That's totally incorrect, he said. The Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons visited here and did not report anything wrong with this place.
Syrians are adamant this was not a place to develop chemical weapons, but rather a place of learning, a research institution where they develop things like pharmaceuticals. What's clear now is that it's gone. This is what you were producing here?
Yes, antivenom.
Syed told us these airstrikes took his livelihood.
This is a big institution. Isn't it possible that there were things going on here that you didn't know about?
No.
No, never, he told us.
Last year's report from the OPCW about the Barza facility noted that the Syrians delayed a scheduled visit due to security concerns. But ultimately, chemical weapons investigators did not find any red flags. But Errol, the Pentagon says destroying that facility will set Syria's chemical weapons program back several years.
Seth Doan there reporting from Damascus. The founder and head of the world's largest advertising agency, WPP, Sir Martin Sorrell, has resigned less than a fortnight after the company announced he was being investigated for misconduct. He leaves WPP after 33 years in the job. Sir Martin denies any wrongdoing. Joe Lynham has more.
You might not know the agencies behind them, but you will know this is WPP funds. Although Sir Martin has strenuously denied any wrongdoing, he said it would be in the best interests of the business if he stepped down now. This resignation is a lot more than the use of company funds. Many believe that WPP is simply not growing like it used to. Tech giants such as Facebook and Google are placing ads directly with consumers and bypassing the advertising agencies controlled by WPP. The share price has fallen by a third over the past year, and many believe that Sir Martin has lost his Midas touch. Sir Martin said the current disruption we are experiencing is simply putting too much unnecessary pressure on the business. That is why I have decided that in the interest of our clients, share owners and all other stakeholders, it is best for me to step aside. Sir Martin will be disappointed that having run WPP for a third of a century, he didn't really get to choose when to step down. Joe Lynham, BBC News.
2 teenagers have been arrested after 5 people were struck by a car in Essex yesterday afternoon. 3 people remain in hospital following the incident in Canvey Island. A 17-year-old boy and an 18-year-old man, both from the area, are being questioned by Essex police this afternoon on suspicion of causing serious injury by dangerous driving. Police have launched a murder investigation after a man was shot dead in Birmingham. Officers were called to a shooting in the Bawdsley area of the city at just after midnight. A 20-year-old man was pronounced dead at the scene. Police are appealing for information from the public. A man has died and a woman is in a critical condition after the vehicle they were in collided with a car during a police pursuit on the outskirts of Stoke-on-Trent. The pair were being followed by officers on the A15 near Longton after their vehicle failed to stop. They collided with a car on the eastbound carriageway at around 6:15 this morning. Staffordshire Police have referred the incident to the Independent Office for Public Police Conduct, which is routine when somebody dies during an operation. A bushfire is burning out of control near Sydney, with the flames now threatening some streets around 20 miles from the city centre. Hundreds of people have been forced to leave their homes, and Australian police say they suspect the blaze may have been started deliberately. Phil Mercer reports.
Strong winds have pushed the flames towards suburban streets, about 35 kilometres from the centre of Sydney. As the blaze approached, many residents left, while others stayed to join a huge firefighting effort. Authorities said the fast-moving outbreak was aggressive and unpredictable. While 500 firefighters confronted the inferno on the ground, they were supported in the skies by more than a dozen aircraft. Very warm autumn weather and a lack of rain have turned bushland on Sydney's outer fringes into a tinderbox.
We have to deal with the worst that Mother Nature can throw at us, and the worse Australians are presented with by nature, the better it brings out the Australian spirit.
Conditions in the fire zone are reported to be easing, but crews will again be working through the night to try to contain the blaze. Southeastern Australia is one of the world's most fire-prone regions. Most outbreaks are sparked by lightning or accidentally by power lines. Sometimes more sinister hands are to blame. Australian police believe this monstrous fire in southwestern Sydney may have been lit on purpose. Experts say that Australia's annual bushfire season is starting earlier and ending later. They believe that climate change is making the threat worse. Phil Mercer, BBC News, Sydney.
Hundreds of thousands of people have protested in Barcelona to demand the release of politicians jailed over Catalonia's bid for independence from Spain. Tensions have been running high in Catalonia since December's elections. The former Catalan president, Charles Puigdemont, was recently freed on bail after being held in a German prison. Spanish authorities wanted to extradite him to face charges of sedition and rebellion. The headlines now on BBC News. Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn has said he would sanction operations in Syria only if they had the UN's approval. Hundreds of Australian firefighters are tackling a large bushfire threatening homes in the suburbs of Sydney. The chief executive of the world's largest advertising agency, Martin Sorrell, is stepping down.